Shall
Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today it was not an easy day for all of us, and it's important to have this opportunity to be together, to learn together. And thank you, Rachel, for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Talia, and thank you, Mayan, and thank you all of you who are here. Like I said to the people who came in first, it's good to acknowledge and to be together for this acknowledgement. So I'm glad to acknowledge this season, this time, what this means together. And we will get to the Torah part and to kind of placing our moment in time and our feelings and our experiences in the many broader contexts of our history and our, lore that we can place them in, or start doing that, or do part of it together. But I want to stay here for a moment. I want to be here in this moment. I don't know about you, but I felt yesterday as if the time itself had a weight, as if it weighed on me. I could feel it in my bones. I could feel it in my posture. I couldn't stand straight. It was just this heavy time. It's almost like a time becomes physical. And while today is not October 7th anymore, it's still not Simchat Torah. Like we're on the way to Simchat Torah. We're like in this weird memorial season, kind of working our way through it. And one of the things that people keep saying is, how can we commemorate when we're still living through the event? Or somebody put it, how can it be October 7th again and October 7th still? And that definitely complicates things and adds another layer of complexity, because usually when we do ceremonies or commemorations, it's a story that already happened. It's something that happened, so we can turn it into a story. Because what do we do in Memorial Day? We tell a story. It's no longer the reality. It's the iteration of reality that we create and shape and massage a little bit and make it useful for us as a thing that gives us meaning, mission, or a sense of direction in our life. But you can't tell the story of an event that's happening right now because it hasn't stopped an event. And to put it more mildly or differently, how can you tell it without knowing the ending? The ending determines the meaning of the story. We don't know the ending.
Yeah.
Yet putting it in these words, in a sense, helps me understand what we're doing when we commemorate, because it reminds me of something else, which is, on a deep and profound level, we never know the ending of anything, right? We can say the Holocaust happened and thank God it ended. But did it? The trauma, the shifts, the geopolitical shifts, the shifts in identities, the shift in international law, those are still happening. And there's still a ripple effect, and we don't know how they'll end. And, Yetziat Mitzrayim obviously ended. We turned it into a story. We tell the story in many different ways throughout the year, especially on Pesach. But the journey that started that didn't end. The Jews were promised this kind of like clear story. You come out of Egypt, you go get your Torah, go to the promised land, boom. That story perhaps ended, but then we also left Israel and came back and left again. And now we're a different kind of people with a different kind of path. And is it still the same story? Is it a different story? In many ways, somebody wrote, a literary theorist wrote once, that we're all born in medias res and we all die in medias res, meaning in the middle of events. Things are always in the middle. We create this artificial sense that something is over and then tell the story. But in many ways, this is an artificial construct that we impose on reality. Now, this may sound extremely theoretical, and I recognize that it is, and like, what's the point? Why talk in these abstract terms? Because I think that it actually, this year, we have an opportunity that, God willing, we're not going to have next year, because next year it will only be a memory, God willing. But we have an opportunity to ask ourselves what meaning we make for ourselves how we live with the memory and how we incorporate the memory into our lives without the illusion of closure. Meaning we're not talking about something. We're talking within something. We're trying to take stock of where we're at because we're at a significant date. We went all the way around the sun and came back to the same position. So it's significant, but we're not deluding ourselves. We're not doing that in a way that then we can, bind a nice bow. How do you say it? Wrap it in a nice bow and put aside and move on with our lives. We can't delude ourselves into that because there's 101 hostages in Gaza, because there are soldiers in Lebanon and Gaza, because we're living it. It's not, we can't delude ourselves into thinking that it's over. So we are invited to make meaning in the event. In a sense, I'm thinking about the Israelites on the way out of Egypt in those 39 Pesachs before they made it to Israel, right? In many ways, they're still in the event. They're still in the Exodus. They haven't gotten to their destination. But it's still significant that they're no longer slaves in Egypt. It's still significant that they have passed through the sea at this and this date. It's still significant that they, who still remember living one sort of life, are now living a very different sort of life. And we're that now. We're still in the journey. We're still in the desert of October 7th, so to speak. We're still looking for the promised land of a peaceful, happy reality. But we're already called upon to try and take stock and understand what we make of where we're standing. And if we consider it in this regard, if we look at it and we say, what do we take from all of that? I think every single one of us here and not here will have a different answer. And at this point, part of the answer is going to be the things that left the strongest impression on us. The most painful deaths, the most horrific stories, the most moving speeches. There are all these obituaries this year that really left an impression in people's minds, in my mind. Some of it is already also going to be based on what our political positions are. What do we think is the right way to conduct the war? What is the promised land we are striving for personally? What do we think is the ending? And then according to that, we will emphasize different things. We saw that a little bit here last year in Israel. I'm sure some of you at least have heard about the fact that there were two big ceremonies, two statewide ceremonies commemorating October 7th. There was a state-organized one that the government put together, and there was an alternative ceremony. Have you heard about that? There was an alternative ceremony. So here's the deal. A few months ago, the government announced that Minister Miri Regev is responsible to put together the state ceremony to commemorate October 7th events. And many people said, how can the government that presided over the failure that was October 7th also be the one to tell us what to remember and how to remember it? And as in particular, the families of the hostages who are protesting against the government several times a week by now said, who are they to tell us what is October 7th? They failed us. We were there hiding in the safe rooms, burning alive and crying into the phones, send the army, and waiting for hours. How can they tell us what this was about? Haratzachta v'gam yarashta, like Eliyahu told King Achav, right? You killed and now you inherit. Not enough that you led us to this position, that you were the ones presiding over it, and now you're also gonna be the ones telling the story. Many people felt that the government is going to use this day to remove responsibility from itself, right? To kind of minimize the level of the mistake, wrong conception, misreading of reality that was involved, and emphasize the good things the government did instead. So at first, there was a group of people from the hostages family who said at the same time that the state is going to hold their ceremony, we're doing our ceremony. And that's going to be led by the families of hostages, by the families of the murdered, by the families of fallen soldiers. And it's going to be our memories the way we want to tell them. And it created a huge split in public opinion because some people said they're right, they're the ones who should tell the story. Well, other people said no, that we are one state, we are one people. What do you mean you're going to have an alternative? What, you're also going to have an alternative army and an alternative police force? I'm not going to bore you with a whole back and forth. I personally found it fascinating because this whole took place when we started reading Sefer Dvarim. And I felt that it was very appropriate because Sefer Dvarim is a book of memory. It's a book of looking back at events and reshaping events. And I'm like, oh, look at that. We're already there. It didn't take us 39 years to get there. We're already at that stage. Eventually, they reached a compromise, namely that there were two ceremonies, but they were at different times. So people could watch both, and it didn't feel like a competition. And in fact, there were people who were participated in both as speakers and as performers. Ba'al Etzion Goel, as they say. Jews agreed on something. And yesterday I sat and watched through many, many hours of ceremonies because of that. Like 1 hour, 2 hour ceremony and another 2 hour ceremony, all filled with the stories of the fallen, the stories of murder, the stories of horror, stories of heroism, songs, Kaddish, Izkor, etc., etc. And you can see that the emphases were different. The kind of, both were beautiful ceremonies, but the kind of story that they were telling was different. And ultimately, each of us has to decide what's the story we're telling. What do we do with all this heavy weight that we are feeling, experiencing, remembering? What kind of story do we want that to become? And as we're considering that, as we're standing, and I realize I've been talking for a very long time, let's go to the text a little bit to break things up. As we are considering that, and as we're about to start reading Bereshit again on Simchat Torah, on the day that has become the yahrzeit of 1200 of our brothers and sisters, on that very day, we will start Sefer Bereshit. And I want to go back to Sefer Bereshit because already in Sefer Bereshit, in the very first parashot, the universal parashot, before Avraham and the Jewish people step onto the stage, the question of how do you deal with big traumatic things is front and center. And I'm talking, of course, about, there's several stories there that deal with that question of what happens after the storm, after the upending of your life, and what kind of meaning do you make from it? Where do you take it? What do you do with it? The first is Adam and Eve's exile from Eden, which suddenly tears them away from their trajectory, from where they thought they were, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and raises the question, what next? How do you go on? What do you do with your life after this? Then there's Cain and Hevel, where after the climactic, pinnacle of the story, after the murder, there's a question of what happens to Cain after. Abel is gone, but how is Cain supposed to live on his life? What is he supposed to do after that? What were Adam and Eve, who raised these two children and now lost one, and in a sense lost the other also? What are they supposed to do? And then there's the flood, where an entire humanity, other than Noah's family, is erased from existence. And somehow Noah and his family are supposed to get out of the teva. And I'm imagining you to put yourselves in their shoes for a second. In the text, it's almost clinical. It's like, oh, everybody died, and then they come out and start a new life. But they're going into a world filled with ghosts, where every person they've ever known is gone. And they have to somehow restart and reorient themselves. And I want to go to those instances and try and find in them some insight into what we are called upon to do, but also some context for the kind of experience, the kind of challenge we are facing now. Any questions so far? Any comments? Okay. Before we go into our exile from Eden, I want to think together for a minute about what it is we lost, because to better understand what's the new path, we need to understand what it is we lost. So I'm not talking about October 7th right now. We'll get back to that. But when we were kicked out of Eden, when our forefather and foremother were kicked out of Eden, what was it that we lost? I'm opening the question to you.
I think we lost a sense of being cared for.
Can you elaborate?
Well, we had all of our food taken care of. We didn't need clothing. We had a place to live. We had all of our physical needs bountifully taken care of. So we had everything. Then you're suddenly without any of that, and you have to fend for yourself. And
yeah, it's like being kicked out of home when you're a kid, or
right.
out of the womb, your parents still take care of you. It's like a certain, like, very rude birth. Let's put it this way. Like you're sitting in a
rude
womb
awakening
environment and you're suddenly not. And also, just to elaborate on what you're saying, Naomi, we all know that making food takes time, right? And especially if you have to grow it, it's there for the taking. So imagine Adam and Eve, who until now everything was just available for them, and now they're out there and it's not, they don't even have, food for the way. Like that, good luck. They have to produce food out of the earth. Good luck. It'll take you time. What are you going to do not to starve in the meantime? It's just all these anxieties of existence.
Not sure what their relationship to God was before they left Gan Eden.
So we'll reopen that in a second. Yes, Sharon. And Donna, I saw you. I'll get to you next. I think I saw you. Okay, right. No? Okay, never mind. Sorry. Yes, Sharon. You're still muted. Sharon, you're muted.
There we go. Now we did it. Okay. Sorry, I'm on a different device today and I'm not as facile with it. Yeah, that first thing that came to my mind was some kind of rupture with God. And I always had the feeling about Gan Eden that they didn't really know what they had, right? Like you don't know what you have till it's gone, but that I don't know how settled I felt they were where they were. But anyway, one of the things that feels like they lost was whatever kind of relationship they had with God was ruptured in some way.
I agree.
And that seems to be a hugely profound loss, maybe even more profound than their physical state.
I would say I definitely agree. I would like to invite you and also others to elaborate on that. What was the relationship like before and what is it now? And what's the quality of it that changed?
Yeah, it's hard to say. And it's hard to say from God's perspective and from their perspective, which might not be the same.
Let's focus on their perspective for a second. I want to be in their shoes, in their minds.
So I don't know how aware they were of God in the first place, right? Like, but now I would say God looms large in their lives. And then there's a sort of maybe rethinking, right? If you didn't think about it so much because this benevolent being just made you and got you there, now you're realizing that you're actually separate, and also that he's not benevolent. Like he's
not wholly benevolent.
Yeah, not wholly benevolent. Right?
I would say, Miriam, I'll get to you in a second, and Gabriella afterwards, but I will just say something regarding what Sharon said here, that it's almost like lost innocence. Like, like children don't notice their parents as entities that are independent, or their mother as an independent entity, as long as she's there. And the milk and the taking care of is happening. And then if she's not there, like they become aware of her, but it's mixed feelings. It's why did you abandon me? And then suddenly, if she's there, it's a choice. But if she's not there, it's also a choice. And I think a lot of us have been feeling that this year. of, wait a minute, God. Before that, we kind of took you for granted a little bit, but now we can't, and now we're a little mad about that also.
Mhm,
What-
mhm.
What's going on? So definitely a lot of complexity. Yes, Miriam.
Can you hear me okay?
Miriam?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I was just going to add, kind of building on what you just said, that they no longer felt like full of power. Like they came from a place where they were literally the partner in creation, like naming the animals and walking lords of all they saw. And then all of a sudden it all comes crashing down. Actually, it came from me, says God, and I
You're
just
losing
withdrew it.
Miriam, what? What did you say? It all came crashing down, what?
All that power actually came from me, says God, and I just withdrew it. You actually had no power all along.
Yeah, I would say conditional power is no power, right? Like if like before that, it's like, God invites you into partnership and says, yeah, name the animals, name this, and then suddenly it reminds me a little bit of Cinderella. I know it's an odd metaphor, but you know how the prince gives her all her riches, and it always feels kind of like, yes, but that means he can take it away. Just like the fairy godmother could give her the dress and then take it away at midnight. The prince giving his riches to Cinderella at the end, it feels very dependent. There's a
It
certain,
makes life very precarious all of a sudden.
I would say that their sense of who they are in the world, their confidence, their sense that they know where to step, and that when they step there, the ground will be there to meet their feet, is gone. I agree with Gabriella.
I was thinking, I think also along the similar lines, but the relationship prior feels almost like God says this, don't, do this, don't do this, and they listen. And then afterwards, there almost seems to be like a more of a richness in the relationship. Like humans start to struggle with God. We start to, it's as you're talking about, almost like a child, like the relationship with an adult child is more complex and maybe also more rich, and it's a give and take in a different kind of way. So I think that there might be more of a richness to the relationship moving forward.
I think you're touching upon something very important, that losing some things comes with gain also, meaning there are certain aspects of life after Eden that may look objectively preferable or better in some ways. And it often comes hand in hand, right? We lose something of the simplicity of our confidence in God. We now have questions and fears and hesitations, but it means that we're more mature, that we have also a little bit more freedom to develop our own opinions about the world, our own understanding of the world. Once you eat from the fruit of knowledge, you can't uneat it, right? That's exactly the process here. They become more complex, they become more mature. I would add to it another thing in the same direction, Gabriella, right? In the same direction, which is they have a job now. Until being kicked out of Eden, I mean, yeah, they named the animals, but that's a one-time thing. And then okay, they're just there, kind of, Now Adam has a mission in his life, which is to get food from the ground, and Chava has a mission to raise children. And those missions are hard, but there's some dignity in doing hard things. God is they're losing the confidence and security that comes from the umbilical cord, but they're gaining the dignity of living their lives. So I think that's a very important axis, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Does anyone want to add something or look at it, reframe it, look from a different direction? Feel free to just unmute yourself and speak up, because I don't see all of you at once. I have to keep yes, Diana.
I have a very odd take.
Mhm.
I have been watching some videos of interviews with children who have been thrown out of the house,
Mhm.
and they don't all do so well, to put it mildly.
Mhm.
There are young people in this country who are thrown out on the streets like an unwanted pet.
Wow. Wow.
And that reality of how little you have is what other people have been saying too. In the beginning, anyway, enough said.
No, I understand. And I think it's a really important point, because what you're tempering here is the assumption that everything they lose and gain is uniform. It's not uniform. You know, if they are the archetype of humanity, if their story is not a historical story, but rather a symbolic, archetypical story that's meant to teach us something about ourselves, right? Each of us is going to lose and gain different things on the way out of Eden, out of the Eden of innocence, of simplicity, of childhood. Some kids are thrown out and they thrive, right? Those are the kids' stories are told about, right? All the stories like Aladdin and Jane Eyre about kids who are unwanted and undesired, but that leaves them space to grow. They form their own life. They take the dignity side of it, the responsibility side of it, and build something from themselves eventually in the end of the story. But there are going to be the people who need the help and the supervision and the providing and the safe space and not going to thrive when they're kicked into the harsher reality of adulthood or independence or work or childbirth or, you know, Adam and Eve's toils. And I think that's something I've become more aware of this year when I saw how different we all experience October 7th as this huge trauma and rupture, but we respond very differently. We experience it very, very differently, emotionally, physically. The kind of things we do, it's all very, very different. And I think that's important and valuable to remember. So thank you, Diana. I want to add another, it's not really different from what some of you said, but it's another layer to the discussion of what we lost, because I think that's a really crucial part for understanding what happens there. And interestingly, it's actually more in the gain side in a sense, but only after you read it carefully. And I'll explain what I mean. The story of Eden stems not from the first creation story, where God creates the world in 6 days and rests for the 7th day, etc. Rather, it's a natural continuation of the second creation story in Bereshit Bet, where first only the man is created and his name is Adam. And then God creates the garden and then the tree and tells him don't eat from this tree, and then says, oh, he's lonely. So he creates the animals and he invites Adam to name the animals, and he sees there's no helpmeet for him. And then he creates the wife and he calls her Isha, and they come together. And then comes the story, the whole story with the tree and the snake, etc., etc., etc. And that second story is particularly interesting, and I learned it with some of you in other contexts, so it'll be a little repetition, but just a little. That story is interesting in that humanity, man in that story, isn't created into a perfect womb. All these things we said about Eden being a place that is safe and full, you know, God provides for you, that's all true. And by the time we reach our story, we're in Eden, that's the reality, but that's not the beginning. If in fact, in the beginning, and unlike in the first creation story, where man is created after everything else he might need is created already for him, the second creation story places man into a very seriously incomplete world, a world where some crucial things are missing. Let's look at it together in the Psukim, okay? Such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created, when God Hashem made earth and heaven, when no shrub of the field was yet on earth, and no grasses of the field had yet sprouted. In Hebrew, not yet is teren, one word, because God Hashem had not sent rain upon the earth, and there was no human beings to till the soil. So man is created into a world that is by definition not ready for him, because he is needed to make it so. The seeds are in the ground, the possibility is there, but until rain comes down and until man tills the soil, nothing's going to happen. So in many ways, the reality that man, at least not woman, but man is created into is a reality that's not that different in terms of its anxieties, in terms of the concerns in your mind, than the reality he discovers when he leaves Eden. right? We said that when he leaves Eden, suddenly all these anxieties of sustaining life fall upon his shoulders. That he's like, how am I supposed to eat? I need to grow things now. I need to start this whole process. But that is something, it's an echo of the primal experience of being created into the world and being like, okay, but there's no greens, there's no plants. I need to do something before they can be anything for me to eat. In that regard, what God does when he creates Eden is almost an interruption in the flow of the story. Because we see the text implies that man is needed in order to complete the world by saying that there's no greens until man is in the world. We have this expectation that now man is going to come and work hard in partnership with God. God will give rain, he will till the soil, division of labor, growth of new life, the world will say. But then God actually sets him aside and creates Eden for him and puts him there. And there's no job for him to do. There's no role, there's no opportunity for the dignity of responsibility. It's an interruption in the story. And Rabbi Yoni Grossman points out in his analysis of Genesis, which I mentioned here last year also, that in that regard, when we're exiled out of Eden, yes, we lose a lot, but in many ways, we're going back to our origins. We're going back to our original role in the world, which is creating something out of it, which is taking the world and bringing its potential into actuality. And fascinatingly, that is exactly what Adam does. Adam and Eve are exiled. We might well think that this is the end of their story, that their whole story is defined by having and losing, by being the men of and women of Eden and then not being the men of women of Eden. But that's not what happens. What happens instead is that they go and build a life. And we see it in, I'm going to skip a little bit ahead, okay? To box here, number 3 in the middle, where we read, now the human, Adam, knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gained a person from Hashem, or with Hashem. In Hebrew, it's et Hashem, which prompts the famous Perush in the Midrash that it's not exactly from. She's not buying it. She's like recognizing it as and in a partnership with God. She created a person. And they don't stop there. She then bore his brother Abel. Abel became a keeper of sheep, and Cain became a tiller of the soil, meaning they're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. Here's the world of raw materials, and 2 generations of humanity take care of it, grow more out of it. Abel cultivates the sheep and takes care of them, and Cain tills the soil, just like we heard in the very beginning of the story in Genesis 2, that man is needed to till the soil in order for the greens to grow up. But not only that, look at the 3rd pasuk. And I have to tell you, it's a pasuk that I think is often overlooked because it's a connecting piece between the story of Adam and Eve and Cain. And we already know that the real drama is about to happen between Cain and Abel. So it's easy to skip it or to kind of rush through it. But look at it. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to God from the fruit of the soil, mincha, a gift. I want to point out something important. This is the first time we read of a human bringing a gift to God. Let's assume that this is in fact the first time it's happening. Now, it doesn't have to be. It could be Adam and Eve already did it themselves, and it's just the first relevant such case. What does it take, though, for Cain to do that? It takes knowing of God, knowing that God is the one that blesses his efforts, understanding that what he's doing is in some way a partnership with God, and wanting to honor that, having the genuine desire to honor that. all of that means that complicated though Adam and Eve's relationship with God has become once they were exiled, it's not done. It's not over. The relationship is still there. Enough for them to bequeath it to their child. So that their child, when he grows the fruits of the land, doesn't see it as a totally unrelated thing to his parents' story or to whatever came before, but rather has a context, has a story in his mind of what's going on and what it requires from him. And this is huge, because what we're seeing here is that Adam and Eve may have lost a lot, but they are also still living their story. They're still seeing themselves as God's partner. They're still seeing themselves as engaged in something that is in some way in relation, not just to pure survival, but to their role in the world and to God. And I want to say more than that. Once we see that it's not an entirely new chapter, but rather, in a sense, a return to their origins and a variation on them, it invites us to think about our trauma and our experiences over the past year in a different way. Because we no longer have to say there was a life before October 7th, and now we have to figure out how to live life after October 7th, as if it's two unrelated experiences, which I'll be honest, sometimes it feels like it. It feels like we're living in a different reality. I just ran into someone I haven't seen in a little bit over a year, and I thought, oh, we met 5 years ago, right? She's like, no, we met last Sukkot. But it just does not compute as the same life anymore. But when we look at the first story of our ancestry in Tanach, it tells us no, it's not really disconnected. It's not a really uncrossable chasm. Now that you're in a new reality or a new phase of your story, what you should really ask yourself is, what was your original role? Where are you coming from? What was the reasons that were the reasons that mattered to you and the purposes that mattered to you to start with? Maybe you knew them, maybe you didn't know them, maybe you understood them, maybe you only understand them now. But those should be at the heart of what you do moving forward. So for me personally, when I look back, so much of what I thought about the world before October 7th turned out to be wrong. I thought that the existence of the state of Israel guarantees that Jewish children will never have to hide from a pogrom again. And I was wrong. And we all have to live with this knowledge, and it's a heavy and jagged kind of painful knowledge. I thought that, frankly, a little childishly now that I think back about it, but I thought we were very close to redemption. I didn't think of it in terms of Mashiach and a white donkey, but I thought of it that, like, we're done all the big things. We founded a state after millennia of exile. We created a new center of Jewish life in Israel. We fought all the big wars. We still have the conflict and the reform and judicial system to deal with, but this is peanuts. That's what I kept telling people when they were arguing about the judicial reform. Like, we're rearranging the furniture, but we already built the house. And now here we are fighting for our lives, quite literally. And suddenly, my understanding of where we are in the chronology of our story is very, very different. However, I still believe that we are the people who have been following God since God told Avraham, Lech Lecha, and the people who understand that living in partnership with God means also that sometimes you fail and then God abandons you. And we are the people who throughout history sought to live up to the ideal of recognizing that all men are created in God's image, and to the ideal that we have a mission in this world, and to balance the two. What is our particular mission and what is our debt of acknowledgement to the rest of humanity and to the human within each of us? All those things are still true. And in regaining them and understanding them and re-centering them, instead of more superficial sense of security or chronology or history, I feel that we follow in the footsteps of Adam and Eve, who at the moment they are thrown away from their Eden, need to reassert who they are in the world. And the truth is that the same can be said of the other two stories of loss that follow. Cain's loss, when after he kills Abel, he is becoming the eternal exile, and Noach's loss, who has to build a life in a destroyed world. Because after Cain kills Abel and God makes Cain into an exile, Adam and Eve, let's talk about the three actors who are left on the stage, Adam, Eve, and Cain. What do Adam and Eve do? Do you recall? They have another child. And this is huge, right? They didn't give up on the whole endeavor just because one son killed the other. No, they have another child. They're building new life. And what does Cain do? He also builds a family. He has children. But more than that, he keeps traveling. He can't stay anywhere, but everywhere he goes, he builds cities. Everywhere he goes, he builds civilization for his children and siblings' children to live in. So he is still finding a way to be God's partner in bringing the potential that's inherent in this world into actuality. And what does Noach do? And this really brings us a full circle. After he comes out and brings sacrifices and thanks God for saving him and his family, what's the first thing that he does? Do you remember? He plants a vineyard. Now, many of the commentators criticize him for that. And they break apart the wording and they say that he should not have planted a vineyard. He should have planted different kinds of foods. And like in planting a vineyard, it's hinting that what he really wants is the wine and the intoxication, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But before we go into there, let's just dwell here in this moment. Here's a man who's lost an entire world and has to restart it. And he plants trees. Trees that bear fruit that can be eaten and drank. Fruit that's useful for humans in many ways. He plants fruits. He is, and this is, I think, worth seeing in the text, Noah, the tiller of the soil, Ish ha'adamah, was the first to plant a vineyard, or in it more accurate to say started or began to plant a vineyard. And I don't think it's incidental that he's called here the tiller of the soil, or in Hebrew, Ish ha'adamah, because it harks back to the creation of Adam Rishon, who's created because the Adamah needs to be worked in order for plants to grow in this world. Noach is preserved from all of humanity in order to be that seed, that man who's brought into an incomplete world to help make it into completion. And he recommits to this purpose after the flood that washed out the world as he knew it. And so, as we look at our own flood, at our own, what I really and truly felt was exile, not from a place, but from a sense of self, from a sense of who we are. And when we look at it in the broader context of the history of not even our people, of humanity, as the book of Genesis presents it, the question for us becomes, how do we personally and collectively recommit to our job in the world, to our work, to doing our work in the world? How do we sit with the pain and the loss and the upheaval and go on? But not just go on like live our life, go on as God's partners, as people who create the world in partnership with him. And I wanted, if it's okay, we have time and I hope it's okay with you, I wanted to share with you from the book of prayers that that me and my friends just put out. I wanted to share with you two prayers. that I think grapple with this question. One, if you'll allow me, is my own. And it's really about that. It's about how do you go on. And one, which is also very lovely, is by a woman named Yael Unterman, who teaches bibliodrama. She's wonderful. She's really a wonderful, wonderful learner and explainer of Torah. And I put it in the source sheet so you can have it later if you want to read it also. I'll start with mine because it's long and I'm sorry for that. It's this one. It's in 2 columns because I couldn't fit it otherwise. And it's called A Prayer for Confidence After Disillusionment. My God, we are not the Israel we thought we were. Our army is not the impenetrable wall we thought it was. So many of the truths we used to know deep in our bones proved false. False like false gold. False like false prophecies. False prophecies spoken with great confidence made our ancestors blind. They decried the possibility of destruction. They called out, "The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord," as if the fact that they had the temple was irrefutable proof of their invincibility, because God won't destroy his own temple, nor would he. But he did. You did. Our own strength proved as hollow as brittle, a reed too splintered to take the weight of our vast confidence, of everything we took for granted, of our false perception of ourselves. We know now what it is to lose this confidence, to learn that nothing is as we believed it to be, and therefore neither are we. We ourselves who breathed these truths with every breath and walked so confidently upon the firm road that these truths placed beneath our feet. We lost these truths and we lost that air and we lost the road and we lost ourselves in this new place of not knowing who we are and what is true and where our feet will land when we step blindly into this unknown. When our brethren's homes burned, so did our confidence. And now we dwell here in the ruins of our self-perception. And my God, it's hard to dwell here in the ruins, where every shard reminds us of the false gold, of the truths we thought we knew about the world, about ourselves. It's hard to dwell where every shard is sharp enough to cut ourselves on, sharp enough to cut and make us bleed songs of lament. It's hard and it's dangerous, for we are not in peace, my Lord, nor do we have the luxury to simply mourn, lament, and wallow. Our enemies and yours are now upon us. We must stand tall. We must fight for our future and your name. And so, I come before you today to beg you for help. God, help us restore our sense of self, our confidence. Help us build it on truer foundations. Help us combine humility with strength. Help us remember all we can't control, yet believe in our ability to make things better. Help us see the true good within ourselves and nurture it. Help us commit to our future, even as we heal from the disillusionment of our past. We have much to be proud of. Our willingness to fight and to defend, our sacrifices, our acts of kindness, the way we hold each other tightly through the storm. Help us turn these truths into a humble and proactive confidence, the kind that is a call for action, instead of the laurels which we allowed ourselves to sink into before. It is up to all of us to figure out what it is we can hold on to recreate our sense of who we are and our confidence in the world. I spoke to the things that I find most grounding, but as time passes and I have more perspective, and I think more and more about Adam Arishon having to find his role in the world again, Like, what is our role? What is our role? Can we build our sense of self and our self-confidence on this role? I want to finish with Yael Unterman's prayer. What I find very, very powerful about it is that it's short, unlike mine. And it focuses on our relationship with God, which was brought up by Sharon and Miriam and many, many of you before as a central change in the exile from Eden, and as a central change, I would say also now. Our relationship with God has become much, much more complicated. I don't know about you, but talking to God in Rosh Hashanah was a very different experience for me this year. And I think Yael faces it head on and honestly. So I would like to read her prayer. It's here on the next page. It's called After the Storm, a Haiku Prayer. After the rainstorm, my umbrella is ragged. Thus, too, is my faith. Many is the time I've patched up my umbrella and used it again, but this hurricane shredded it to bits. Now I speak to you through holes. In other words, and I'm not going to say a lot because I think it speaks very powerfully for itself. We all live through crises that make it difficult to talk to God, that make our relationship frayed. In some ways, October 7th tore it apart. But even the holes can be a thing we talk through. Even the fractures, even the places where we lost faith or our faith changed, or we have questions and fears where before we had maybe a more simplistic reliance, like we said about Eden, that you just, God is there, he's this benevolent, presence. Even those places can become a channel of communication if we look through them, if we look at them and through them and ask ourselves, not only if we don't hide from that, but rather face those holes head on. And my prayer for us, my prayer for all of Am Yisrael, is that we will have the courage, now that a year is coming to its close, to look at these holes, to look at what we lost, not to delude ourselves about it, and then ask ourselves who we are now and be very honest and brave and proactive as we face this question. And my hope, and here it really is, I think, up to God to some extent, is that as we do this process, we will find that our answers bring us to a place where we can grow closer to oneself, to each other, not tearing each other apart. Let's leave that to our enemies and stand together now. Thank you. Thank you for being with me here today. Thank you for so many of you for being with me here this year, like no other. I hope that we will all be nichatem for a good deen, all of Am Yisrael. And I hope that when we make it, God willing, through Sukkot and all the way to Simchat Torah, we will find it within ourselves to read about the creation of the world in Shul and recommit to being part of that process and not just think of everything we lost. Shana Tova.
Amen.
Thank you so much,
Shana
Rachel.
Tova.
Shana Tova.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Shana
Thank you.
Tova. Thank you.
Tanach.
Be well and be well, healthy, God willing.
Amen.
Amen.